Welcome everyone to this session on what role for carbon dioxide removal technology. My name is Antonia Gawel. I head climate change at the World Economic Forum, and it's really a pleasure to have you all here today. I will say that the topic of climate change and really driving progress on climate change is something that we are putting all of our weight behind at this annual meeting, but I think also as an organization. We know that we are not where we need to be in terms of progressing climate action. At best, we're on trajectory for a 2.4 degree world. We need to hit a 1.5 degree world, which requires all actors, businesses, governments, all of the stakeholders here with us today to really do more. So we need to drive work in this agenda, and I think this is why we're really happy to have you joining us here today. In order to kind of drive progress, there's a couple things, of course, that we need to do. First and foremost, we need to reduce emissions. We need to reduce emissions. We work with over 120 CO climate leaders and others. Christian Mumenthaler is co-chair of that group, to drive companies to set net zero decarbonization commitments, not only to 2050, but to 2030, and to take action. So we need to reduce the emissions of those companies. At the same time, and this is a sort of yes and situation, the IPCC did recently come out and remind us of the crisis that we are in. We have overshot on progressing climate action quickly enough. We're now in a situation where we need to reduce, and we will need to remove a significant amount of carbon from the atmosphere. And that's what we're here to really think about and put on the agenda and talk about. It is arguably potentially seen as a controversial topic. This is not something we want to discuss because we want to detract attention from reduction. Absolutely, we need to reduce. But we also need to recognize what the science is telling us, that we also need to really start thinking about removals in various forms. I'm very happy to have a whole panel of experts with me here to talk about this topic and to think through some of the nuances, where the technology is at, what we need to do to kind of ramp up action, investment policy as well. So let me just start by introducing our panel, and then we'll dive in here quite quickly. So we have Varun Sivaram, who's the Senior Director for Clean Energy and Innovation with U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Secretary Kerry's office. Thank you for joining us. Nili Gilbert, the Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct. We also have Christian Mumenthaler, CEO of Swiss Re, and also I mentioned co-chair of our CO Climate Leaders. Anne Mettler, the Vice President of Europe for Breakthrough Energy, and of course, last but not least, Renat Huberger, the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of South Pole Carbon Group as well. So welcome to this conversation. So I think just to get us started, I'm going to turn the floor to you, Nili, if you could talk to the audience, this group, about what are carbon removal technologies. What does this whole topic mean? Give us a bit of insight in terms of why it's important, but also what it is exactly we're talking about today.
Well, thank you so much, Antonia, and thank you to the World Economic Forum for hosting us, and to all of you for being here for this conversation. As you said, when we think about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, the science is now very clear that we need to focus on two sides of the equation. We need to reduce positive emissions as far as we can, and then remove the rest. I find that it's helpful to go through the carbon math, the carbon budget itself. I promise it won't be too much math, but when you think about the remaining carbon budget, we have about 400 gigatons of emissions that we can continue to emit left. And right now we're emitting about 56 per year. So on average, the average country has 8 or 9 years remaining in their total carbon budget. For a high-emitting country like the US, where I come from, we only have 3 years left in our carbon budget. So when you think about strategies to reduce emissions, science tells us that we should be able to use advanced technologies, improved efficiency, and things like this to reduce emissions by about 80%. That means that we'll have about 10 gigatons left that we need to remove. Now, when it comes to ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere, we have two strategies. Nature itself acts as a carbon sink, and we are continuing to improve our forest management, to move into renewable agriculture. Scientists estimate that as we continue to improve our relationship with nature, that nature itself should be able to remove 2 to 4 out of those 10 gigatons. This means that when it comes to engineered removals, if we're to achieve the 1.5-degree goal, that we need to be using engineered removals for 6 or more gigatons a year from almost nothing today. And so this is a huge goal. The more that we overshoot that 1.5-degree pathway where we reduce emissions by 7.5% per year, every year between now and 2050, the more that we're going to have to remove. So one of the things that is really important in getting the community ready for the scale of engineered removals that we're going to do is to continue to raise the conversation about the good news that these technologies are working. There are hundreds of companies now in the field that are doing direct air capture, they are doing mineralization, biomass, carbon sequestration or bikers, ocean alkalinization. These technologies are working, and we know that because at Carbon Direct, we're advising our clients on buying removals in these solutions, and we're investing in these companies. The challenge that we have now is really scaling, and I think you're going to hear about this a lot across the panel. Scaling will mean bringing down costs, it will mean improving policy support, it will mean scaling up the clean energy that we need to power these facilities, and it means continuing to have conversations like this to raise public acceptance and understanding of these technologies. So thank you again.
No, thank you for that. Maybe I'll turn to you, Anne. I mean, you're with Breakthrough Energy now, very much investing in technology solutions, but you do also come from a background in policy. Could you maybe talk initially about how we make sure this doesn't undermine basically the progress in actually decarbonizing upstream? So how do you look at this in the context of driving decarbonization, these types of solutions?
Thank you. So as you already said, I spent almost my entire career in public policy, so I've had a front row seat on many of these kind of discussions. And what I need to say is what has always bedeviled action in climate change is essentially sort of a collective action problem. No one wanted to go first because they thought they would be at a disadvantage. Now, to the extent that there is a global leader today, it is probably the European Union with its Green Deal, but we also know it's 7% of global CO2 emissions. So even if the Europeans do everything perfectly, it will not be enough. Huh? So overcoming this collective action problem is really, really one of the major challenges. So of course, and I think you said this, Antonia, in the beginning, we need to continue to put pressure on governments, on companies to reduce emissions. But we also at this point, because of the urgency that was just described, we need to be open to other solutions. And this is why I would very much advocate sort of a portfolio approach. Yes, you know, companies need to do what they need to do to decarbonize, but we now need to, as I said, be open to other solutions. And carbon dioxide removal is a very promising one. It was just said. I mean, the key challenge is really around the cost. You already cited the IPCC. I mean, so we know what the scientists are telling us. And let me say that that we also, I think we need to be very clear and honest that despite all the talk and the good intentions by CEOs and governments, the fact is that carbon dioxide emissions rose to their highest level ever in 2021, according to the IEA. And I would really therefore argue that, we really can no longer afford to sort of look at removals and reductions as mutually exclusive. I think you also said that up front. But there needs to be a much higher degree of honesty in this debate. We are not on the right track despite all the good words and good intentions. So we really need to prioritize carbon dioxide removals at this point.
And if you kind of follow on from there, there's the policy dimension to prioritization, and we'll come to that, but also the technological one. I mean, the cost you mentioned is quite high in terms of where you're seeing the technology today, and yeah, just kind of how Breakthrough Energy is looking to drive the cost down.
Absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, what we need to say is that the CDR market is very small. I mean, what we're talking about is peanuts in the scheme of things. So these are small-scale projects, a few demonstration plants. It's not enough. So we're looking at costs right now ranging from $400 to $2,000 per ton. So it's way, I mean, this is exorbitantly high. But we believe that the costs can come down to $100 per ton or even lower. So you may know we have portfolio companies, and they think they can even bring it to a lower price. And I do think that there are really some legitimate questions around scalability, around feasibility, but to me and to Breakthrough, I have to say, that is really just an invitation to get serious about innovation. So not to question the technology, but to say, what do we really do now to double down on this, to kickstart the innovation that we need, the demand that we need. So we have a program called Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, where DAC, so direct air capture, is one of the priority technologies. And essentially, sort of, we take a blended finance approach to invest in projects. So blended finance means that we bring together corporate funds, but also philanthropic capital. We work with governments, and essentially we're trying to sort of create what I would describe as a new generation of public-private partnerships, because the fact is no one can do this alone. Government can't do it alone, and I think we need to be clear that business can't do it alone either. So we try to de-risk these projects, drive up the scale, and by doing that, lower the cost. That, in a nutshell, I would say, is the approach that we take. We have very ambitious partnerships with the European Commission, with the US government, as Varun knows, with the United Kingdom, with Mission Innovation. So I can say from where we sit, there's huge appetite on the side of governments to do more, including here, where I have seen, I'm based in Brussels, a real evolution in the European Union and the European Commission in particular, where a few years ago, carbon dioxide removal was seen as the easy way out. No longer is. It's now taken very seriously, and there's real action behind it, because we have understood, or the EU has understood, it's the only way that we're going to get to net zero.
Yeah, the only way, along with reductions, and I'll keep saying that.
Of course, of course.
In addition to.
Yes.
So I think that's, I mean, it's a great segue, Varun. You sit in government, and you very much focus on innovation and driving innovation. You know, the role of policy, the role of government in actually trying to advance these solutions of various types, right? Maybe speak to that first, and I'll come back on the technology.
Well, first, let me just say, Antonia, and to the whole WEF, thank you. You have been an extraordinary partner to the US government. We have something called the First Movers Coalition together with Breakthrough Energy and others. And we'll have some exciting announcements this week about how businesses are stepping up in carbon dioxide removal in particular. But Anne, you're right. Businesses alone can't solve this problem. It will take businesses and governments working together. Why governments, as Antonia asked? Well, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, as Nili mentioned, the 6 gigatons of engineered carbon removals, what we're trying to do beyond fight climate change is something fairly useless. See, when you take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, some of it could well be used to produce some useful products, synthetic jet fuel, for example, but most of it is going to go into the ground. It's going to be sequestered in deep saline aquifers. It's going to be turned into rocks, basically. And so governments have to make it worth the while of the private industry to do this extraordinarily large-scale removal. So what does government have to do? 3 things, in my opinion. First, government's got to help to develop the technology, some of these breakthrough technologies that Anne was talking about, and scale it up. Second, government's got to, again, make it worth the while. Create incentives so that your private players actually invest in sucking this carbon out of the atmosphere. And third, I think governments have to play an important role in what I call system planning and architecture, in making sure that we've designed our societies to take advantage of our industrial strengths to remove carbon and put it in the ground where it best can stay put. Now, I work for the President Biden administration, for Secretary Kerry, and I think President Biden's done important work on all 3 fronts. Look, already, President Biden and the Secretary of Energy have announced an earth shot, a carbon removal earth shot, aiming to get the price of carbon dioxide removal that's durable, that can last millennia, down to $100 per ton or less, way lower than what Anne was just talking about, which is today $600 to $2,000 a ton. President Biden also, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, has enacted $3.5 billion for carbon dioxide removal hubs, 4 of them, in the United States, along with pipelines, for example, that we'll have to build out. We're not the only ones. Anne talked about Europe, Australia, Canada. Many others are investing in carbon dioxide removal on the government side, but there's a whole lot more we got to do. Governments have got to ramp up investment in research, development, and demonstration for some of these new technologies, and we'll talk about that in a bit. It's important to continue to develop the incentives because, again, we're asking companies to suck carbon out of the air, which is often an expensive endeavor and requires lots of energy. You can do this through tax incentives, for example, as President Biden's proposed in the United States. You can do this through public procurement. So there's a range of ways to make it worth private industry's while. And finally, governments are going to have to work on the system architecture part. We'll have to map out where are the reservoirs, the saline aquifers. As it so turns out, oil and gas producers tend to have a lot of great unused pore space that you can go and sequester carbon dioxide in, and it'll stay put for a long time, millennia. We'll have to work on pipelines to carry carbon dioxide. We'll have to develop international standards so that when someone removes carbon from the atmosphere, they really get credit for it. They really don't today. So a range of things that governments will have to do, and I think President Biden, the European Union, and others are all leading the way. Thanks.
So I think there's the policy dimension, kind of the innovation agenda, basically, that you mentioned and the ways to do that. We heard about the cost of the technology, the cost of the technological removals, which, again, this varies. There's different types of removals, and they do vary in their costs. So I think that's important to recognize. But from the technology side, do you want to sort of speak to where you see the agenda right now? Where are we in terms of sort of the technology development space, let's say, of removals?
And we've got a ways to go. Look, I'll focus in on what Nili started by talking about the engineered side. Because, first of all, nature-based solutions are fantastic. But when it comes to durability, there's no way you can plant a tree and guarantee that you'll guarantee a millennium or more of carbon storage. You could have a forest fire. And today, on the engineered side, particularly on direct air capture, which is capturing carbon directly from the atmosphere, we are woefully low. We've got, we're measured in the kilotons, maybe 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide removal a year, 18 pilot facilities around the world. One facility in the US will be at the million tons or megaton level sometime in the middle of this decade. And what we really need is around 100 million tons by the end of this decade in 2030. We really need to start scaling up to get to the gigaton scale by mid-century. Why is this so hard? Well, today, here's a technology we tend to use. I'm giving you a couple examples, but there are many approaches. One way to do this through direct air capture is to basically have a machine where air contacts something called a sorbent, a set of molecules that will catch on or adsorb the carbon dioxide straight from the air. And then once you heat up the sorbent, it'll release that carbon dioxide into a very concentrated stream, and you can bury it underground. You can do something called mineralization, where you turn it into rocks. You can do something. You can even turn it into jet fuel, for example, by combining it with hydrogen. The problem is that it's extraordinarily energy intensive today, and we're still working out the kinks in these sorbents. Some are liquid, some are solid. And so looking forward, there are kind of 3 major research areas. There are actually many research areas, but I'll pick 3 of them. One is new sorbents. It would be great to have a molecule that was highly selective for carbon dioxide. Look, this is a hard task. In the atmosphere right now, we're looking at less than 1% of the atmosphere's carbon dioxide. It's mostly nitrogen, oxygen. There's water vapor that you're competing against to capture that carbon molecule. You also want to have not that much energy that it takes to, once you've caught the molecule, to release it, so then you can go bury it or do something with it. And you want that molecule to last a long time, to have a long lifetime. In addition to the actual physics of the capture machine, you also want really cheap sources of clean heat and clean power, because that's what it takes today. In Iceland, the largest facility that exists, it's a solid sorbent facility. And what these guys do is they require geothermal electricity and heat at about 100 degrees from geothermal energy. So we need cheap power and heat. It can come from nuclear, it can come from geothermal. And then finally, there are really new directions we can go. One of my favorites is from MIT. It's a technology called electroswing adsorption, where you can use electricity to tell your molecule, your sorbent, to stop, to let go of that carbon molecule. They use a molecule called quinones. And if you use only electricity, you can use just renewables, wind and solar power, for example. to tell your carbon dioxide capture device to let go of the carbon dioxide. So I'm really excited about the future directions for technology.
Super, thank you. So I mean, as you can see and as you can hear from Varun, this is an incredible innovation agenda. It's everything from figuring out how to support this from a policy perspective to the actual innovation, the chemistry, the physics actually that are starting to surface, and the opportunity that we can actually invest in to drive this forward. We're going to change the conversation a little bit because we're going from deep technology solutions to Christian, who's the CEO of Swiss Re. And as you think about, as you hear this conversation, you look at your own commitments that you've set to decarbonize your company. How do you think about this? How does this enter the equation of one, you have your reduction, kind of core reduction objectives. How should CEOs be thinking about this part of the equation as they invest in their plans?
Thank you. I'm happy to represent the CEO Alliance, which is 120 CEOs. I see some of them here in the room who have committed to net zero 2050. They have intermediary goals, and they publish the CO2 emissions. So it's trackable and traceable, and they've put themselves under huge pressure. So now the reality of the matter, of course, for these CEOs is as they look ahead, nobody has a plan until 2050. It's a commitment at this stage, but nobody, also no country, has a plan until 2050. I think it's important to note. So there's a lot of discussion within the group where we exchange views, ideas, processes, and things we can follow. And I would say what is crystallizing, in my view, as best practice is that the initial reductions are going to be done by every company by their own, because there's lots of things you can do today that is NPV positive. You don't need the help of anybody else. You can just do it, and that will help you for the first few years. After that, you get to the really difficult decarbonization. This is when you need green steel, green aluminum, green concrete, etc. And there are companies who can produce that. They know how to produce it, but it's much more expensive than the normal materials. And so these companies are not investing in it, in these facilities. Now they start to invest because they start to have some other companies in the value chain, so it's essential to work across the value chain, who made purchase agreements, who say, I will buy your green aluminum. So there's companies for whom aluminum or steel is just a fraction of the production cost and who can afford. And that's the first one to step forward. So that's the whole idea around this First Movers Coalition, is to find companies who can afford a high price, or at least part of that in their products. Like Apple for aluminum is a very good example. So this will then encourage companies to produce green cement, green steel, etc. But this is going to be frustratingly long, because there's now facilities where you try it out, but then you need to scale it over the whole world. It's going to be massive. It's decarbonization of everything we produce. This is gigantic. But this should then be the second part, and it's essential that CEOs get involved into the second phase. And as we have really heard very well, even that is not going to be enough. It's extremely likely that we'll need a carbon capture. So carbon capture, you could say, is science fiction. Let's wait for it to come. But you have just heard that the capacity that is produced today is absolutely minimum. So the plant from Climeworks is a Swiss company, by the way. We have invested in them. We have pledged to pay for some of these removals. Is in Iceland, is 4,000 tons. This is really nothing. We need a scale up of a factor of 1 million to get to where we need to go. And that means that by 2050, this needs to be the size of the oil and gas industry. And we need to produce this industry from scratch. And what nobody said here is actually the IPCC report says that starting 2050, we need a constant removal of 10 to 15 gigatons per annum for another 50 years. So it's not just to balance it out 1 year. Nobody talks about the rest. The rest is actually removal, net removal for 50 years. So it's just massive. So I think it's essential already today for CEOs to say, okay, there's this last phase, and we need to encourage this startup scene we have today. It's very small, promising, but very small. But we already need to invest some money in that. But to avoid that these 120 companies all now have to hire PhD students who have a PhD in carbon removal and try to figure out what to do, we agreed to create a platform together where we can purchase together some of these carbon removal credentials. So actually we have a collaboration with South Pole now. The facility is ready. We have 5 companies who have pledged 10 million each. And with these pledges, they will source projects that are at a certain level, and these projects will be able to get financing because you have purchase pledges from these 5 companies. And of course, we hope many other companies from our alliance to join that. So I think it's already important now, even for a fraction of your CO2, to invest to help basically the efficiency curve. It's just part of the overall program. So I'd say that's the 3 pieces as I see them in a very practical way for CEOs of the alliance and also from CEOs outside of the alliance.
So it's, don't wait. I think that's the perfect segue over to Renata. I mean, maybe you want to talk a bit more about the work that you're doing at South Pole. Of course, it is to kind of scale. How do you scale and support these technologies through these types of facilities, but other measures?
Yes, so also from my side, first of all, thanks a lot, Antonia, and to the World Economic Forum for this invitation. It's always tough to go last after such a stellar panel. Nonetheless, South Pole, we are a developer of projects. We have been doing that for the past 16 years. And we're really technology agnostic. We've done nearly 1,000 projects in over 50 countries. And last year, we delivered about 50 million tons of verified emission reductions, which is about 10% of the global market, which is about 500 million tons. And a lot has been said about scale. Let me just add one more aspect to this discussion. So if your figures are true and we need those 10 gigatons, and we bring costs down to $100, they are above 100, the multiplication gives us $1 trillion that we have to put down every year. Okay, that's a lot of money. But if you think about, so the global GDP is about $100 trillion. So we're talking about the 1% of the entire global GDP that we have to put into removals. But if IPCC has a point, and they typically have, unfortunately, a point, which is that climate change could cost us 20% of our GDP, then that's actually not that expensive. Right? Then actually it becomes a good bargain. And if you add the notion that still today, globally, the world spends $500 billion on fossil fuel subsidies, we're starting to have a deal here. So the question is how to move from what we just heard, and I can confirm that, out of this 500 million tons last year, 70,000 were technical removals. 25 million, by the way, were nature-based removals. So they're ahead at the moment compared to technical removals. We come to that point. But if you compare that, so the dream is, of course, to repeat the trick we pulled with solar power and wind power. How was it possible to move that down the cost curve so much? One of the key reasons was that Germany had a rate that they introduced sometime in the early 2000s. The German ratepayer had to pay for it, but it unlocked an entire production of solar PV, and costs came down the curve. Battery storage came down the curve. What do we need to do here for repeating that trick? And it's exactly buying commitments. And that's why we're so proud and so thankful to Swiss Re and our other buyers who have said, we're going to move. First, we're going to have a commitment that other companies hopefully will follow, because that is the start. And of course, we then have to crowd in many more. And of course, governments, as we heard, the US government, the European government, so that we have this catch-up effect. And all of a sudden, that $1 trillion doesn't sound outrageous, and we might actually drive costs even below the $100. That's really why I think today here at the World Economic Forum, we're at an important cross point, because we now have those commitments, which I hope in hindsight, when we reflect annual meeting 2022, we remember that was the start when the ketchup came out of the bottle on removals.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give the audience a warning that I'm going to come back if anyone has any questions in just a minute. So get any 1 or 2 questions you have in your mind ready. But I think this point about money flowing maybe into the wrong place, the cost of inaction, but actually the need to flow money into the right places. Again, kind of deploying the solutions that we have today that are cost competitive. They're not kind of being deployed as fast as they need to be, but also investing in the innovations. And as Varun said, of course, we have an initiative, the First Movers Coalition, exactly to do this. We need to drive investment into innovation today. But Nili, I want to come back to you on this point as well, because as we said, there's a lot of capital sitting on the sidelines. Either it's sitting on the sidelines, committed, quote unquote, to support decarbonization, or it's going into the wrong direction. But how do we unlock investment into these types of solutions, and how can this really benefit actually development and social inclusion on this agenda? Because that is such a critical part as well.
Well, when you think about the scale, the enormous scale of the opportunity that's ahead of us, this is actually the kind of thing that captures the imagination of finance. The truth is that we're going to need to build an industry that is much larger than the oil and gas sector that we have today. If you just think about volumes of stuff moving around the world each year, we're going to need to move twice as much carbon by 2050 as what we're moving in fossils right now. And so, as you've heard, we're going to need to put trillions of dollars into this market. And so there are a lot of opportunities for finance to get involved. In fact, we're not going to be able to address these opportunities without the significant participation of finance. At Carbon Direct, we work with a number of financial institutions, and there are several different ways that finance is connecting. One is, first, just, of course, understanding their own emissions, not only their operating emissions, but their financed emissions, and looking at all the strategies required to get those down to net zero. When it comes to carbon removals, financial institutions should really focus not on removals against their own balance sheets, but on how they're helping companies in the real economy to achieve their net zero goals. And so there's a lot of education, product development, and client support involved to bring the real economy along the way, but which finance can help to drive. And then, of course, all the projects. There's project finance opportunities where finance is stepping forward, thinking about how to make this capital available at a competitive rate, and then investment opportunities to invest in the great companies that are coming forward to be able to really scale this over time. Another thing that the finance sector is quite active in is using its voice to make the call to policy. Acknowledging that the private sector alone is not going to be able to achieve all of these goals, and finding the right ways to work in partnership with our government leaders to be able to get this done. As Varun was discussing, when you think about the financial math of carbon management, what we really want to see is that the financial incentives for doing this work are aligned with the social benefits for doing it. But if we don't have financial incentives for managing carbon in the atmosphere, and we do still have significant financial incentives for polluting and emitting carbon, it's going to be hard to bring all of this together. And so a lot of financial institutions, as I said, are finding appropriate ways to bridge with our policymakers to figure out how to work in coalition to get this done. And then the last thing that I think will be very helpful, well, the last thing that I'll mention today that I think will be very helpful in getting financial capital to come forward is finding the right way to acknowledge and support the conversation about technical efficacy. As we've said, these solutions are working, but the technical efficacy now really has to do with understanding solutions to scale and what those cost curves are going to look like. And so this is why at Carbon Direct, we're employing around 50 climate scientists who really try to help understand what that technical progress looks like. It helps finance sector and industry actors across the board not only to understand the pathways that they have ahead, but with that understanding to have the confidence to step in and move real capital.
Great, thank you. So I think I have one question from the floor, and then if there's another one, I'll take sort of 2 questions, 3 questions, starting over here.
Mahendra Singhi from Dalmia Cement. The carbon removal will play definitely very important role in that too, particularly for cement sector where 50% can be taken care by various processes, but 50% which comes out from the process, that has to be now removed. So either it can be removed from the air or it can be the capturing from the process itself. So it will play a very, very important role. And second, I would say that as a company, we have a very specific plan that how year by year the CO2 would be reduced and how by 2040 it will be carbon negative. So my two suggestions. One, there should be some methodology in international carbon market so that whatever carbon removal is done from the air or from the process, that becomes eligible for carbon credit, so that will be able to fund it. And secondly, the initiative which has been taken by FMC, the support of the US government and the WEF, and with the many corporates. So there also, those companies would be ready to buy some product which have a high cost of the green premium. So we must try carbon removal either from the air or from the process. And I think the model which Breakthrough Energy have developed, I think if that can be developed by various governments also, like by US government or any other, then that may be helpful for developing country. Developed country, yes, they have their own resources. But developing countries and emerging economies like India, we would require those demonstration projects. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm just going to hand the mic here. I'll come back to the panel in just a moment. I'm keeping my eye on time, so just one or two other points, and then we'll hand it back.
I think perhaps the most famous technological development project in the world is the Manhattan Project. The United States government in today's dollars spent about $30 billion over 2 years to do that. What I'd like to ask you guys is, A, how complex is developing this technology relative to the technology of the Manhattan Project? And B, is there any government in the world presently committed to spending $30 billion on developing it?
Thank you.
And I might add, if not, why not?
Super. A last quick point here, and then what I'll ask you to do is respond, and also kind of we'll do a quick closing in parallel. Sorry, we lost the mic. It's coming back. Just here.
Thank you. Val Miftakov, CEO and founder of Zero Avia, one of the BEV portfolio companies on the hard-to-abate sector side. So we built aviation engines. My question is about capital allocation. So any capital allocation is really a prioritization game. So how do we ensure uniform prioritization approach across abatements and carbon removal? And I think having that will also help the messaging that you talked about, some challenges of how these two types of technologies are often pitted against each other. And if you have a uniform, easy to explain prioritization across, that would be helpful.
Absolutely, great. There's so many questions and so much depth that we can go into on this topic in 45 minutes and stuff. So what I'm going to do is hand it back to the panel now. I mean, there's a point on sort of approach, standardization markets, kind of massive scale investment, but also kind of some of the technological points in terms of prioritization and capital allocation. So I think I'll ask each of you to kind of pick the dimension that you would like to respond to relatively quickly, but also just use this as a moment to close with your last reflection on what you're most excited about kind of in the context of driving this agenda forward. So we'll go along the panel, Varun.
Great. I'll start here. It's actually a terrific question on capital allocation. Forgive the shameless plug. I didn't mean to bring this up, but before I joined the Biden administration, I wrote a book called Energizing America about how the United States could launch a so-called Manhattan Project, but for clean technologies, how we could quadruple our clean technology research and development budget. And one of the fundamental points was on capital allocation, which is historically the United States has spent far more on technologies for renewable electricity than technologies for industrial decarbonization and carbon dioxide removal. If you do a bar chart, the bar is like off the chart for some of the highly emphasized ones and very, very small for carbon dioxide removal. President Biden rectified this through the bipartisan infrastructure law. You asked about a $30 billion Manhattan project. Look, President Biden's bipartisan law is $21 billion in just one single go, in addition to annual appropriations for clean technology demonstration projects. So the US is well on its way to funding clean technology projects, but in doing so, it's changing the capital allocation. It's investing in industrial decarbonization, $9 billion for hydrogen investments, $3.5 billion for carbon dioxide removal. So that the bar chart is becoming more equitable. And that speaks to, we have many needs, not just renewable electricity, all of which are important.
And just to say you have 15 seconds left.
in my last 15 seconds, I'll just say to Renat's wonderful point, we are sort of like where we were 10 years ago for renewables. But let's be careful. It's not just you build a bunch of whatever technology and it will get cheaper. You have to be very purposive and intentional. Today's carbon dioxide removal technology may or may not be the one that gets us to the gigaton scale removals we've been talking about. We need to be very purposive about, do we invest in the current generation? Of course. But as Antonia said, let's also be investing in that next generation so that we learn and innovate on a technology platform that really is scalable, durable, and can reach gigatons of removal. Thanks.
Thank you. Really?
I'd like to respond to Mr. Singhi and talk a little bit about the intersection of our global economic development goals and carbon management. The truth is, as I mentioned, it's really the highest emitting countries that are soon to run out of our remaining carbon budgets and which have put a huge amount of legacy emissions into the atmosphere. I was talking earlier about the 56 gigatons of flows of emissions that we're putting out. There's also 1.6 trillion ton stock of emissions, 40 times the flow that we have put out through the course of our industrialization and beyond. And so when you think about the justice issues across countries around how we manage carbon, I also think that managing carbon removals is one of the way that those with the wealth to be able to do it have to be able to create room for sustainable economic growth in countries like India and beyond.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have to cut you guys off just because I'm looking. We have 3 minutes left, but if you have a last point, go for it.
Just on the one thing I'm excited about, it's the multidisciplinary effort that's going to be required to achieve all of this. It's entrepreneurs, it's finance people, it's government. At Carbon Direct, our company was founded on a principle of cross-disciplinary talent coming together to solve tough problems. And this type of cognitive diversity is also the type that will unleash the creativity that we need to face the climate challenge overall.
Absolutely. I love that. Christian?
Yeah, I'm active in the climate field for about 15 years, and I'm positive about the change we are seeing now. The last 2-3 years is a massive, massive change of pace, and so I'm much more optimistic than I was at the time. And these 120 companies that have pledged net zero 2050, they're, including scope 3, they have 3.5 gigaton of footprint. So it's the third biggest country on Earth. And that's because they have probably 100,000 of companies delivering goods to them, and they themselves have goods that are carbon intensive. So it really means something that they now work together. And what we hear in these gatherings we have, tomorrow 72 actually come to our lunch, is this huge energy and huge amounts of investment finally in their core products. So my sense is, as more and more of these leaders go ahead and start to produce green steel and green cement, etc., there's going to be a secondary movement of people who feel left behind. It's not a question whether you believe in climate or not. It's a question that you will be left behind because your product will not be sellable in the future. And I think that will create a significantly bigger movement than anything we saw before. So I'm more optimistic now than I've been in these 15 years.
Absolutely. And
Right, I'll take the one on the Manhattan Project because we recently actually studied it in the context of what was done in the development of the COVID vaccine. And it inspired, I mean, this is maybe one of the good things that the previous administration did with Operation Warp Speed, because essentially they studied the Manhattan Project. They took out all the complexity, they did public-private partnership, and they said, anything that stands in the way, get out of the way so we can develop a vaccine faster than we ever have done it. And I think with the climate emergency and a war that is very much fought over fossil energy, now we may have this moment, a very unique moment where an energy breakthrough is really maybe within reach if we bring all the actors together and we say we need to do this much faster and we need to have an ambition that we've never had before. You mentioned 30 billion. I looked up the figures this morning. In 2021, Europe imported Russian fossil energy to the tune of 100 billion euros. We have paid Russia, since the beginning of the war, 53 billion euros. It is largely what is financing this war. So if we think about 30 billion, we better think again. If we say these technologies are too expensive, I say we cannot not afford them at this point.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anne.
So,
Last word to you.
yes, my last point is once again on capital allocation, of course, because that's what we need. And it has a link to your point as well on cement. We are currently building the infrastructure that you need to make those different technologies comparable, which is the calculation methodologies. 1 ton must be 1 ton, must be 1 ton, with the same degrees of additionality and permanence. Once you have that, you will find there's different ways to remove carbon, and they come at different prices. To your point on cement, we're working on one methodology which is around mineralization. That could become a new cement product. Yes. So all of a sudden, you might actually have a big business with this. Or just think agriculture for a second. What if we were managing to put trees into cocoa fields in Ghana, making those soils more healthy? We could actually remove carbon by making money in Ghana for the farmers. So that's going to be possible once we have this infrastructure. And thanks to those commitments, we now have the pull to actually do that. And that's why that's at the same time the topic that excites me a lot.
Great. Great. Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I think thank our panel really for this great discussion. It is again an issue that we know we need to put on the radar, but we also have incredible tools, innovation, partnerships, policy that can help us get there. So wishing all of you a good day. Thank you again, and enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you.